Ernesto, how are you?
Good.
It is. These AirPods are not working, so we're going AirPodless here. But you're good. I see
Wow.
you. Looking good. Welcome, Mr.
Got a new
Renda.
haircut for the Instagram Live.
Very nice. I should have done the same. I was derelict in my haircut.
Looks good.
Thank you.
Messy. Very West Coast.
Absolutely. We try and keep it casual elegance here at the gallery.
hmm
Yeah. Well, anyway, I guess it's about that time, 10:59, 11, 2 p.m. your time. So I guess we will begin. I want to just start by welcoming all of you here to this first ever Moskowitz Bayse Instagram Live with the inimitable Ernesto Renda, whose incredible show Dithering I am sitting in. And I guess that what we'll do here is maybe a little sort of conversation between Ernesto and myself, and I'll walk around the show, and if you haven't seen the paintings, you'll get a chance to see them. Obviously, they're also on our website. So without further ado, Ernesto, I will walk around. Well, maybe you say a little something about how you made these and the process.
Sure. So these paintings are made with a rubbing process. If anybody knows about like grave rubbings or leaf rubbings, basically it involves having some kind of texture underneath of a surface like paper or fabric, and then when you rub something like charcoal or pastel, in my case, you reveal what's underneath on the surface. So for a long time I was making textures and using a big relief fingerprint to make rubbings. And then I would sort of do a different drawing on top, and the paintings would be a kind of like a conflict between those two images. And then this year, during lockdown, I was working with a wall actually that I couldn't make that many holes in. So I decided to just glue the canvas to the relief itself and see how that would work. Which then took the shape of the paintings that you're seeing in this show, where the relief itself is underneath the canvas. And the relief is made with a hot glue gun. So I like the way the hot glue gun kind of squirts in very exact lines. So usually you would use it to just squirt a blob somewhere and glue two things together. But I like to use it as a drawing tool, and it allows me to make these textured line drawings, which make the rubbings on top.
And
And the
Ernesto,
rubbings
we
are
talked
done
about,
with pastel.
and then the acrylic ground obviously resists the pastel and creates that amazing black that I think is such a sort of important element of the paintings that
Right.
obviously we've talked about referring to the screen in that the black does, and it kind of casts it as this kind of glow and this inner light. And it's interesting you talked about making these during lockdown, and I think it's worth noting we had this conversation, but how or where you were when you made them and how that kind of came about out of necessity and why you decided to focus on the imagery that you did and where that sort of came from.
Yeah, so like I said, I was working with a wall. I was in my parents' basement, and I had to quarantine from them because I came from Brooklyn. Um, so I was kind of in the basement a lot for 2 weeks or so. And I didn't have much to do, so I was watching a lot of TV and movies. And I distinctly remember that when I had the TV on, but not a like DVD player or cable box, there's just kind of that black screen, but when we have a black screen, it still sort of has this backlight on. So that's kind of a way that I think about color in my paintings, that like everything is going to look brighter than the black ground because the black ground is what a screen looks like when you've actually turned the machine off. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I wanted also for you to maybe mention the, because there's such a sort of diversity of images here. I mean, obviously they all come from filmed filmed references, if not film itself. This is Trump on Charlie Rose in 1992, and this is the new Alien Covenant movie from a couple years ago, and Michael Fassbender. And there's the uniting factor, which is the partially subjective shot. And I thought maybe for our audience who hasn't yet read the press release of Dithering, which I encourage them all to do, then maybe
Really well written.
you could explain a little bit about what a partially subjective shot is and how you find this sort of a connection between that in cinematography and in painting.
Yeah, so the basically in film language there are first of all subjective and objective shots, and subjective shots are things that are seen by a character, and objective shots are sort of a disembodied camera that's watching a scene from the outside. So a partially subjective shot is, or an indirect subjective shot is another way of saying it, is when you're looking over the shoulder or like behind the head of a character. So you are sort of not, you're not embodying the character. You're this sort of spectator to the scene in front of you. Um, and I just think that puts the viewer in an interesting and sort of privileged position because they switch from standing on behind one person's shoulder to another, so they're not necessarily fully identifying with any of the characters. Um, and that's sort of the magic of film, is that like in a split second you are switching who you're empathizing with or who you are beholding as an object and like perceiving as an object versus perceiving, from the other point of view. So those shots also end up being very like mirror image. And if you take them and superimpose them, you have all kinds of funny coincidences, like the eye of one person matches up with the eye of the other, or the ear, even though it's really big in one shot, ends up being exactly like where another ear is. And I don't necessarily plan all of those correspondences, but I love that they become revealed when I'm doing this rubbing process. Because with every rubbing, you kind of start with a blank sheet of canvas, and you don't know exactly what's going to come out, and that is interesting to me. But in terms of how I choose images, I sort of think of it as like a automatic drawing process, and I often will go on to YouTube like right in the morning when I kind of have a clear slate head and I see like what is coming to mind. It's kind of like journaling too, I guess. Like what scenes from like a movie that I saw 10 years ago are suddenly what I feel the urge to like go back to. So a lot of the works are referencing things that I vaguely remember from my like adolescence or childhood, or even just a couple years ago, but things that have kind of stuck with me. Um, and then I guess the Kiss series is more of a focused, uh, um, like media dive. It's more of like a research project where I searched out scenes where Russell Tovey kisses another guy in a movie or a TV show, um, because he is this out actor, and there are a lot of like actors I think who aren't out, but he has sort of claimed his space as a openly gay actor playing gay roles. And there's a whole other conversation of like straight actors playing gay roles. But he's also very much like a person who's a mover and shaker in the art world. And he has this following, and he's a collector, and he's a podcaster. So I think that his off-screen life is also interesting. So seeing the connection between these images, which are from like fiction movies, being this actor who actually has nothing to do with, like Russell Tovey's life has nothing to do with these characters. But when you put the paintings
Right, I think it's almost
other,
funny how
they do have something to do with one another.
yeah, it's funny to me how all of these, kisses you have to then realize are actually these sort of dispassionate affairs where both people are acting, and it's sort of, no more charged perhaps even than, than the Sopranos, or than a sort of TV interview or whatever it may be. And that, I think that also leads into, Ernesto, I know we've talked a lot about your interest in media theory more broadly, and how you sort of think about that connection to your work, if you want to talk about that a little.
Yeah, well, I studied media theory in college, and I do feel like I bring that sort of thinking to painting. I'm not necessarily someone who stays within the discourse of painting proper. And I like this concept that I learned about when I was studying Pier Paolo Pasolini, and this concept of contamination, which is the idea of like one type of media contaminating another. So there are many times when the medium of painting contaminates film and the way film shots are framed and whatnot. And so in my paintings, it's sort of the reverse, where the medium of film and the way that figures and faces are framed in film starts to contaminate the painting language. And then there's also another sort of vector of literature, because the free indirect speech in literature is when a narrator sort of speaks in the third person, but from the perspective of a character. So there's like, it's kind of the same thing as the over-the-shoulder shot. So I see those over-the-shoulder shots as a contamination between a literary way of thinking and a filmic way of thinking. So that's really the media theory concept that I'm most interested in.
Yeah, and it's funny, I mean, you mentioned, I guess this sort of goes back to your earlier point about how you select images, but I think it also has to do with what you just said. And you mentioned something that I really, really loved. You said screenshotting as a sort of drawing technique almost, and how you think of the screenshot as a sort of preparatory process in a similar way that you sort of think of drawing. And I would imagine that the sort of capturing of the right screenshot is sort of akin, as you said, to that sort of media contamination, where you're thinking about screenshots in the sort of, in the guise of, or in the sort of clothing, let's say, of painting. And maybe you could talk about your sort of, your approach to finding images, and how that sort of crosses over again from that sort of way of thinking about media and way of thinking about film into painting, and how you sort of identify the connection there.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I kind of realized early into this process and this body of work was that I didn't want to work with iconic film stills. And I think that there are other artists who work with like iconic images in a really nice way, but I was more attracted to the film still's ability to like communicate something more mundane or universal. So when I'm looking at like a scene, I look for what is interesting compositionally, And it's not, I mean, because there's another way I could do it where I would be like Google image searching. And what I would come up with is this sort of communally agreed upon image that represents the scene. But for me, it's a very specific thing of like what frame hits me the best. And I end up taking like probably 20 screenshots from a like 3 second interval to try to get the exact one that I want and the one that I think will play with the opposite shot the best.
That's interesting. So it's sort of, the idea that the image is not sort of pre-digested. It's sort of organic, and it comes from the film, but in a sort of similar way, you kind of, you sort of impose your own will on that kind of filmed moment, and you sort of think through it in a completely different sort of lens. You think through it for a totally different compositional value, and for obviously thinking about the quality of then the reverse image, and there's something sort of that goes beyond even the intention of the filmmakers. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's something sort of interesting about the kind of connection between the painting and the source, is that you're thinking about these images in a totally different way. I mean, I think this is a great example, because this is sort of such a charged image now that, at the time it was filmed, really wasn't. It was, two people on a fairly, mundane evening talk show. And obviously now,
Yeah.
looking back, there's such a sort of charge to this image. And so your role becomes almost an arbiter of what these images sort of evolve to mean, or what they can mean in a poetic sense, in a historic sense. And I think that's
Yeah, I think
an
that
important
they
aspect of the
can
work.
mean more when you have the two sort of subjects playing off of one another. And I like this. I like to sort of narrativize myself as if it's like a scene of four people, and maybe that there are like two sides of someone, and it's actually you're looking at more subjects than just Trump and Charlie Rose,
Right.
because both of them, because he kind of has this like gesture, like I gotcha, and yeah. Um,
Yeah, I encourage everybody to actually go search that interview, Trump on Charlie Rose in 1992. We watched it here at the gallery, and it's fairly prescient and somewhat disturbing, as you can imagine. Obviously, the two people involved and where that all headed. But it's really it's quite something. And
yeah.
maybe the last thing I'll ask you, Ernesto, is what you see as the relationship between found and created imagery, because I think your work almost falls somewhere in between, as we said, because you weren't the cinematographer of record on these films and on these shows and whatever it may be, but so in that sense it's found, but as you said, there's such a sort of deliberateness with how you go about choosing it that it becomes a sort of creative act. So I'm curious as to how you think through the sort of fundamental difference between found imagery and sort of primary created imagery of your own, let's say, of your own camera.
Yeah. Well, I think that the Kiss series sort of led me, it was productive in that sense because the series was thinking about something beyond the frame that I was working with. And it becomes as much about like Russell Tovey as this like figure that's the umbrella figure of all these paintings. And what I think I'm really interested in is contaminating, to use that word again, contaminating the my body of work with images that I've actually made up myself, and like adopting filmic framing devices to tell my
And is that
stories
is that
that
a
haven't been produced by Hollywood, um, because I think that like yeah, like lend itself to thinking about is
And is that a preview, Ernesto, of what's to come in these paintings? Your own imagery? Guess there's a little connection
hello.
glitch here. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
You hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well,
Yes.
obviously the Wi-Fi is working against us a little bit, but I think maybe it's a good time to field any viewer questions if there are any.
Yes. If
Ernesto,
anyone has
I'll
any
let
questions.
you be the arbiter of what you want to answer. If anybody has anything they want to toss
I
up
don't
there.
think anyone's asked any questions. I do want to
Well,
shout out to David Moffat, who he's an LA collector, art lover, who told me that we need to do more than just post Instagrams. So I'm glad he encouraged me to do this Instagram live. I don't know if he's
absolutely.
listening.
Uh, it's been a great experience. I think I'm happy moving the camera around and talking through your paintings with you. It's such a treat to be able to have the show up and live with the work for a couple weeks. And I think hopefully our audience agrees. It's an important body of work and a sort of new way of thinking about images and the structure of a painting. And I'm just, for one, really honored to be part of it.
Aw, thanks, Ace.
Thank you, Ernesto. And I suppose
And
if there
thank
are
you, Merrick and
no,
Adam, if you're like secretly in the background.
they're secretly watching. I think they're in the audience. But so if there's no questions, I guess that will conclude our programming.
If anyone has any private questions, you can DM me. Private
And you can
questions,
DM the
absolutely.
gallery too. You can DM us both and start a group, and we'll talk about Ernesto's paintings. All right. Well, Ernesto, talk to you soon. It's been a pleasure. This is Dithering. All right. Signing off from Los Angeles, California. Goodbye, everybody.
Great.